Who was Robert E. Lee? After 30 years of military service, Lee led U.S. Marines to crush the attempted slave rebellion by radical abolitionist John Brown in October 1859. 21 co-conspirators had seized a federal armory, and all of them were killed or captured, including John Brown, who was tried and hanged for treason.
You guys seem to enjoy my series looking at weird alt-right subcommunities, and it seems you guys are also liking my series on booze. No, I'm not talking about the Mario ghost, I'm talking about weird historical revisionist communities or popular sort of sayings people push online. So recently we had the Tojo Boos, who are these simps for Imperial Japan during World War II. We also had Leeaboos or Boers, who are simps for apartheid South Africa. And obviously the most notorious ones are the Xeroboos, who are simps for the Nazi military during the Second World War. Now, I end with that one because it is very similar to the Leeaboos. So, General Leeaboos. People who push revisionist history about General Lee and the Confederacy during the American Civil War. And there's some nice parallels with General Rommel as well, sort of painting Lee as this figure who didn't believe in slavery, who wasn't racist. He simply did it out of loyalty to his state, which decided to join the Confederacy, sort of like how Rommel totally wasn't a Nazi and he only fought the war for the Nazis because he was loyal to Germany, not that he actually shared their goals, ambitions and beliefs. Also, thanks for the support recently, it's been really great, and as loyal subscribers will know, we get a new chocolate orange for every 5k. So we're about to hit 26k, let's keep this chugging along, let's get to 30k, and who knows, maybe we'll have a nice symmetrical little column of chocolate oranges going on there. So this is probably in the title somewhere, but let's look at this stunningly racist video by PragerU on who General Lee really was. I saw a comment on this video which made me laugh and just summed it up. It's basically, mask off, hood on.
Who was Robert E. Lee? Statues of great historical figures, like Robert E. Lee, are being torn down across America. Here are some facts about Lee that remind us why his statue should remain. Robert E. Lee was connected to George Washington through his father, Light Horse Harry Lee, Washington's cavalry commander, and his wife, Martha Washington's great-granddaughter. Lee's home at Arlington House was just 10 miles from Washington's Mount Vernon. Today, it is the site of Arlington National Cemetery. After 30 years of military service, Lee led U.S. Marines to crush the attempted slave rebellion by radical abolitionist John Brown in October 1859. 21 co-conspirators had seized a federal armory, and all of them were killed or captured, including John Brown, who was tried and hanged for treason. Lee deemed slavery a moral and political evil in any country, but considered it a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, since blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa. Opposing secession, Lee foresaw no greater calamity for the country than a dissolution of the Union. But when Virginia seceded in a close vote, Lee resigned his commission. Despite offers to command Union forces, Lee opted to organize the defense of his native state. After 4 years as Confederate commander, Lee became an icon of reconciliation upon his surrender. As president of Virginia's Washington College, he favored education for freed slaves but opposed their right to vote.
So is it meant to be a positive thing that General Lee crushed slave rebellions and captured John Brown, which led to his execution? And John Brown was this radical abolitionist who used a lot of violence for his political goals. Quite a cool guy, but you know, apparently it's good General Lee went after him, and isn't it so good that General Lee also thought Africans were better to be enslaved in the US than rather live free back in their African countries, and also after the war advocating for free slaves' education but also saying they shouldn't have the right to vote. Apparently this guy isn't a racist according to a lot of people. But before we get into the Leeaboo comments, and trust me, there are so many Leeaboo comments. Leeaboos are essentially the mainstream conservative movement in America. Let's not forget all this massive pushback to the statue stuff, things like Charlottesville, tons of other movements that people getting really mad that General Lee, like schools, General Lee statues are being taken down. And basically, America is starting to address its racism by taking down monuments to people who literally fought a war against the United States so they could keep slaves. And we're also going to get into this Confederacy revisionism, where apparently, to a lot of people, slavery was a really minor part of the causes for the Civil War and the Confederacy movement. We're going to get into what these guys believed as well. So drawing parallels with the Leeaboos and the Rommel stuff, basically after World War II, various Nazi generals were put in positions of power in West Germany. They also helped write the Western history of the war, leading to lots of myths about, the Soviet Union, things like Asiatic hordes, and how capable they were. Basically, this myth they pushed that the Soviet Union would send wave after wave after wave, and the only reason the Nazis lost in the East is because the Soviet Union didn't care about the lives of their men and would just send as many as possible until the Nazis were overwhelmed and pushed back to Berlin. So a good article on BuzzFeed by Adam Serwer is titled "Why We Are Finally Taking Down Confederate Flags," but it's really good at going into how the revisionist history became mainstream. So the article says, as historian David Blight writes in his 2001 book Race and Reunion, in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, former Confederates and their supporters waged a propaganda campaign to shape American historical memory. The result was a popular understanding of the war and its aftermath that glamorized the valor of Confederate soldiers, downplayed slavery as a cause for the war and a cornerstone of the Confederacy, recast Reconstruction as a period of tyranny and black domination, and justified the violent disenfranchisement and dispossession of black Americans for decades to come, even after the narrative of a benign and honourable Confederacy fell out of favour with historians. It continued to dominate American pop culture in film and literature. The damage wrought by this interpretation of history is immeasurable. It is only now unravelling. Most important, it was always untrue. Slavery was the cause of the war. White supremacy was the cornerstone of the Confederate society. So how this historical revisionism came about was, shortly after the war, Blight writes, former Confederate General Jubal Early gained control of the Southern Historical Society and used it to launch a propaganda assault on popular history and memory. Later, groups like the United Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy worked to control historical interpretation of the Civil War. In this interpretation, popularly known as the Lost Cause, some nice parallels with a noble cause about Vietnam, the Confederacy was fighting for some vague concept of liberty, not the right to own slaves. Its soldiers were unparalleled warriors defending their homeland who were only defeated because of the Union's structural advantages, and the post-war subjugations of black Americans was a necessary response to the lawlessness. So Blight says that this interpretation of the war and Reconstruction fostered a national reconciliation between the North and South, but on the terms that sacrificed black freedom to white supremacy, going on to say, the general white public, the national leadership of the Republican Party, and the federal government on every level were arriving at the conclusion that African Americans did not merit citizenship and their freedom was not valuable enough to justify the conflicts they endangered among whites. This historical interpretation provided the moral underpinnings for Jim Crow and the brutal neo-slavery of the convict leasing system. So that is very interesting there, and sort of says the North's own racism against black people helped facilitate this myth spreading and helped create the Jim Crow South. But this revisionist history has seemed to never go away. But now let's get into what the Confederates believed in terms of slavery. So something you constantly hear with Leeaboos, and we're going to read a lot of Leeaboo comments after this part of the video, but there was a Cornerstone Speech, also known as a Cornerstone Address, which was given by the Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens on March 21st, 1861, delivered a few weeks before the Civil War began. Now, what did this guy, the Vice President of the Confederate States, how did he feel about slavery? How did he feel about black people's place in the Confederacy? Why did the Confederacy fight this war? Let's get into his speech. So our new government, its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition, This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based on this great physical, philosophical and moral truth. This truth has been slow in the process of its development, like all other truths in various departments of science. It has been so ever amongst us. Many who hear me perhaps can recollect well that this truth was generally not admitted even within their day. The error of the past generation, those at the north still cling to these errors with a zeal above knowledge we justly denominate fanatics. All fanaticism springs from an aberration of the mind, from defect in reasoning. It is a species of insanity. One of the most striking characteristics of insanity in many instances is the forming correct conclusions from fancied or erroneous premises. So with anti-slavery fanatics. So there you have the Vice President pretty much saying the Confederacy is established with the one universal truth, according to him, that black people are not equal to white people and their natural condition is being enslaved by white people. So just to put to bed any myths that the Confederacy was somehow not fighting to keep slavery, there you have the Vice President saying it's a central cause and a central cornerstone of the Confederate States of America. Now let's get into General Lee, and let's start this part by looking at Leeaboos. This will give you a good indication of all the myths that these people believe about General Lee, and then we're going to debunk them just like we debunked this notion that the Confederates somehow didn't fight for slavery. So this bit might be a bit long. I might not comment on every comment, but then we're going to get into an overall debunking at the end. So Stix3791, I don't know if that is the YouTuber, but Lee opposed the South's secession and even acknowledged that slavery was on its way out, but fought for the South out of loyalty to his state, Virginia. Therefore, clearly the only thing to do is revise our history books and tear down all monuments to the great men such as Robert E. Lee. Eli Kipperwitz saying, it's really incredible how organizations like you, the SPL Center, teach people to hate Robert E. Lee, tearing down the statues of a good man and a great American figure without telling his story, and the man he was. Besides, he was a Confederate general. Stephen A. Kaufman saying, Lee was an American hero. That's a funny way to describe a traitor to the United States. This is beyond wrong. I'm ashamed of America. General Aguilar saying, the Civil War was an affront to states' rights, as the South had every right to secede. As Lincoln was America's first real nationalist tyrant, such things should be handed at the state level between the people of the states and the government of the states. Libertarian Party of Connecticut says, Lincoln fought a war that killed almost 1 million Americans so he could retain power and tariff income from the southern states. He shut down hundreds of newspapers for disagreeing with him and jailed thousands of years in military prisons without due process. So there's also this framing that Abraham Lincoln is a tyrant and General Lee is some sort of libertarian hero. So Porton81 says, idiots and lefties have been denigrating the South Confederacy for decades. They want to destroy our heritage while ignoring the facts that the Civil War was not fought over slavery and that Lincoln was a murderous tyrant who caused the death of 800,000 of his own people. Someone else, Paulie V, saying, I can't even begin to express how upset I am about the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee from the Capitol building in Washington. He was a great general, a great hero to millions of Americans who fought a valiant battle for their individual states against tyranny they felt. The tyranny of not being allowed to own other people as property. So Virginia removes Robert E. Lee statue from the US Capitol. Someone else saying they deleted their profile now, but Robert E. Lee was a great leader following the war, and he himself said he did not want any statues of himself anywhere. While he did fight for the rebellion, he was still a great man. His goal after the war was to rebuild the South as part of the US. But I agree, we don't need statues of him at the US Capitol building. The Virginia Capitol building, yes. Robert E. Lee statue removed from US Capitol. Someone saying, Robert E. Lee disagreed with the side that wanted to keep slaves during the Civil War. Those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. Wendy Rogers says, Robert E. Lee was a great patriot and a great leader. I don't understand how you can be a patriot while waging a war against the very country that you're meant to be a part of. They're just not tearing him down. They are coming after all of us. Get involved now, you could be next. Someone else, Robert E. Lee wanted slavery to end, but he was from Virginia and said he could never fight against his home. This is similar stuff you see about Rommel, but he wasn't a Nazi, but he couldn't go against Germany. Him and Grant went to West Point together too, they were friends. If you seriously believe that Robert E. Lee is just a monument to white supremacy, you don't know your history. Virginia exists today because of him. If you live here, you reap the benefits of his work. Dinesh D'Souza saying the left's unrelenting attack on Robert E. Lee, who condemned slavery and opposed secession, is part of a big lie. but liars to blame slavery entirely on the South and cover up the role of the Democratic Party, whose northern and southern wings both protected slavery. So which one is it? Because the Democrats were the slave owners and plantation owners, but you're also saying Robert E. Lee opposed this and condemned slavery, even though he fought for the Confederates. Very big brain logic there. So Camo Magnolia saying, did you know Robert E. Lee was against slavery? He only fought for the South because the idea of turning a musket on his brothers and cousins was unconscionable. But he literally did that because he had family in the Union. Magnolia Girl saying, I urge you to read a bio of Robert E. Lee. He was an amazing person. He was deep in his faith against secession and against slavery. He turned down command of the Union Army. He could not fight against his beloved Virginia. He believed in states' rights. Hashtag he deserves a statue. Oi, Robert E. Lee wasn't a white supremacist or a bad person. Yes, he was a Confederate general. That seems pretty, white supremacist and a bad person. No, he wasn't an ignorant racist. He's the American version of Rommel, if anything, on the bad guy's side, but not an evil person. So there you go, plenty of historical revisionism that we're going to get into all of it. But like I said, even this guy at the end says, he's like America's General Rommel. And I would agree with him there, because there's plenty of revisionist history about both of them that whitewashes their views and whitewashes their action. So Adam from the first article also wrote another really good one about the myth of the kindly General Lee. So let's get into this. So Lee was a slave owner. His views on slavery can be found in an 1856 letter that is often misquoted to give the impression that he was some kind of abolitionist. In the letter, he describes slavery as a moral and political evil, but goes on to explain later, Lee saying here, I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly enlisted in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by the wise, merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than in the storms of the tempest of fiery controversy. And this is an extremely racist view of slavery, which goes back to the 1400s. There's actually documents of Catholic priests seeing the first African slaves arrive in the Vatican City, and they say something. I remember this one guy says, my heart broke to see families torn apart, but they're better now they're Christian, and this will lead them to a better life, and they will get into heaven. This is the logic that has justified African slavery primarily for essentially 400 years. So it goes on to Lee as a slave master. So Lee's cruelty as a slave master was not confined to physical punishment. In reading The Man, the historian Ellis Brown Pryor's portrait of Lee through his writings, Pryor writes that Lee ruptured the Washington and Custis tradition of respecting slave families by hiring them off at other plantations, and that by 1860 he had broken up every family but one on the estate, some of whom had been together since the Mount Vernon days. The separation of slave families was one of the most unfathomably devastating aspects of slavery, and Pryor wrote that Lee's slaves regarded him as the worst man I have ever seen, in quotes. The trauma of rupturing families lasted lifetimes for the enslaved. It was, as my colleague Ta-Nehisi Coates described it, as a kind of murder. After the war, thousands of the emancipated searched desperately for kin lost to the market, for human flesh, fruitlessly for most. In Reconstruction, the historian Eriq Brown quotes a Freedmen's Bureau agent who notes of the emancipated, in their eyes, the work of emancipation was incomplete until the families which had been dispersed by slavery were reunited. Lee's heavy hand on the Arlington, Virginia plantation, Pryor writes, nearly led to a slave revolt, in part because the enslaved had been expected to be freed upon their previous master's death, and Lee had engaged in a dubious legal interpretation of his will in order to keep them as his property, one that lasted until a Virginia court forced him to free them. That totally sounds like a non-racist guy who opposed slavery. Someone who messes with another person's will so he can keep people in slavery. When two of his slaves escaped and were recaptured, Lee either beat them himself or ordered the overseer to lay it on well. Wesley Norris, one of the slaves who was whipped, recalled that, not satisfied with simply lacerating our naked flesh, General Lee then ordered the overseer to thoroughly wash our backs with brine, which was done. So brutally punishing slaves that he owned, sounds like he pretty much supported slavery. So Every state that seceded mentioned slavery as a cause in their Declaration of Succession. Lee's beloved Virginia was no different, accusing the federal government of perverting its powers not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but to the oppression of the southern slave-holding states. Lee's decision to fight for the South can only be described as a choice to fight for the continued existence of human bondage in America, even though for the Union it was not at first a war for emancipation. Now to his actions during the war. During his invasion of Pennsylvania, Lee's army of Northern Virginia enslaved 3 black Americans and brought them back to the South as property. Pryor writes that evidence links virtually every infantry and cavalry unit in Lee's army to the abduction of 3 black Americans with the activity under the supervision of senior officers. Soldiers under Lee's command at the Battle of the Crater in 1864 massacred black Union soldiers who tried to surrender. Then, in a spectacle hatched by Lee's senior corps commander, A.P. Hill, the Confederates paraded the Union survivors through the streets of Petersburg to the slurs and jeers of the Southern crowd. Lee never discouraged such behaviour. So after Lee was defeated and the Confederacy ended, Lee told a New York Herald reporter in the midst of arguing in favour of somehow removing black people from the South, disposed of in his words, that unless some humane course is adopted based on wisdom and Christian principles, you do a gross wrong and injustice to the whole Negro race in setting them free, and it is only this consideration led the wisdom, intelligence and Christianity of the South to support and defend the institution up to this time. Lee also wrote, "You will never prosper with blacks, and it's abhorrent to a reflecting mind to be supporting and cherishing those who are plotting and working for your injury, and all whose sympathies and associations are antagonistic to yours. I wish them no evil in the world. On the contrary, will do them every good in my power, and know that they are misled by those to whom they have given their confidence. But our material, social and political interests are naturally with the whites." And like that PragerU video even admitted that Lee was also against the enfranchisement of black people. And this article ends with a good point that some Confederates did try and redeem themselves. So it says, one thinks of James Longstreet, wrongly blamed by lost causes for Lee's disastrous defeat at Gettysburg, who went from fighting the Union Army to leading New Orleans integrated police force in the battle against white supremacist paramilitaries. And of course, Lee never did anything like that. So from history, you can actually see Lee was an awful person who led an awful army for an awful cause, a racist white supremacist cause, treated his own slaves really badly, wanted to keep slaves so much that he would mess with someone's will so he could own people who were set to be freed upon the owner's death, led soldiers who massacred black Union troops, and then after the war was still extremely racist and didn't want blacks to vote and said they were better off being slaves. So this guy is not an American hero even on the surface level, even if he was this mythical figure that Leeaboos like to, make him seem like honourable, gentleman, not racist, not for slavery. Just did it out of a duty to his state and his family. Like someone like Rommel, apparently, who wasn't a Nazi. But like with both these historical figures, these guys are awful guys. They did believe in the cause. I would say Lee more explicitly believes in the Confederate cause, opposed to Rommel and what you can find, even though both seem to believe in these awful causes. So let's please dispel the notion that these two somehow just fought for honour and their country or state. Not that they were fundamentally complicit in this stuff, and both of them had abhorrent views on race. And Lee is extremely explicit about this. So on the surface, Lee was a traitor, and it's also found that he did like having slaves, he did treat them really badly, and he was extremely racist. And he fought for a traitorous army that fought a war that led to hundreds of thousands of Americans being killed. So guys, let me know what you guys think of Leeaboo. Let me know what you think of the video. Please like the video. Maybe share. Send this to someone who loves General Lee, for example. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Come join our communities on Discord and on my subreddit. Please check out my Patreon. Stuff like this is always demonetized, so your support is greatly appreciated. Check out my podcast with my girlfriend Holly. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.